Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely wild, complex, and honestly kind of shocking true history of the 1001 Nights, or Alif Laila. This isn't just some dusty book of fairy tales. We are talking about a sprawling, architectural marvel of global literature that took literally a millennium to build. I'm so excited to dive into this with you because the story behind the stories, it's honestly way more thrilling than the fiction itself.
Right, so let's kick things off with a quick question to test what you think you know about this famous collection. When you hear Arabian Nights, your brain probably jumps straight to a kid, a magic lamp, and a flying carpet, right? So, was Aladdin an ancient Arab tale? Take a second. What do you think?
Well, the answer is a massive no. It was actually a Western edition. I know, it completely shatters the illusion right out of the gate, but it's the truth. For the longest time, historians thought the French translator Anton Galland just completely made Aladdin up out of thin air in the 1700s to pad out his book. But the real story is so much cooler. Bottom line though, Aladdin was absolutely nowhere to be found in the original medieval Arabic manuscripts.
So the enduring myth is that Aladdin is this ancient Arabic folktale. But researchers recently found this amazing 18th century Arabic manuscript hidden away in the Vatican Library. It was an autobiography, and it proved the actual fact. Aladdin was created by a real, living, breathing guy named Hanna Diyab. He was a young Syrian Maronite Christian storyteller from the city of Aleppo.
And what's so wild here is how Diyab's own real-life journey directly inspired Aladdin's whole rags-to-riches glow-up. See, when he was young, Diyab was recruited by this French treasure hunter named Paul Lucas, who was scouring the world for antiquities. Lucas promised this poor Syrian kid unimaginable wealth and dragged him on this crazy, treacherous journey. Sound familiar? It's literally the exact plot of the evil sorcerer who claims to be Aladdin's uncle and drags him to the Cave of Wonders. Plus, Lucas brought Diyab all the way to the Palace of Versailles. Just imagine being a broke teenager from Aleppo and suddenly standing in the middle of the most ridiculously opulent palace on earth. That mind-blowing experience, that became the royal palace in the story. And finally, Diyab was an outsider, totally fascinated by the exotic French court. Combine that with Galland being a Frenchman obsessed with the exotic East, and you get this bizarre cultural mashup. It explains that weird setting paradox where the text claims Aladdin is set in China, but all the characters have Arabic names, practice Islamic customs, and are ruled by a sultan. It's a total blend of their two worlds.
Okay, so how did this Syrian storyteller's tale actually end up in the famous book? Well, back in 1704, that French scholar I mentioned, Antoine Galland, was translating a totally genuine Arabic manuscript, and it was a smash hit in Paris. People went nuts for it. The problem? He ran out of manuscript stories way before hitting 1001 Nights. To feed this absolute frenzy for more content, Galland ended up meeting Hanna Diyab, who was visiting Paris at the time. Diyab just sat there and narrated all these folktales from memory. Galland absolutely loved them, scribbled them down, and literally just stuffed them right into his published volumes. Just like that, these hybrid Syrian-French oral tales like Aladdin, Ali Baba, and Sinbad the Sailor became the global face of the Arabian Nights.
Which, brings us to this massive realization. If Aladdin, Ali Baba, and Sinbad aren't the original text, what actually is? What is the true beating heart of Alif Laila?
To answer that, you have to picture the book evolving like a giant literary snowball, rolling across centuries and continents, just picking up bits and pieces as it goes. It is a wildly complex, multi-layered anthology shaped by centuries of cultural fusion. No single author wrote this thing. Instead, it was stitched together in three distinct historical layers, stretching all the way from the 8th century up to the 15th century. Let's peel these layers back one by one.
At the very bottom, the bedrock, is the Indo-Persian core from the 8th century. That iconic frame story we all know, where the brilliant Scheherazade tells cliffhanger stories to King Shahryar every night to keep him from executing her. That is distinctly Indo-Persian. It totally mirrors the structure of ancient Indian texts like the Panchatantra, where a narrator tells stories within stories within stories. Persian writers adapted this Indian framework into a book called Hazar Afsan, or 1,000 Stories. And even though that original book is completely lost to history, we know for a fact it existed because a 10th century Arab historian explicitly wrote about it.
Moving on, as these stories traveled into the Abbasid Caliphate between the 9th and 12th centuries, they soaked up a whole new culture. This is the Baghdad layer. The Persian texts were translated into Arabic, and the whole vibe shifted to Baghdad, which was this insanely wealthy, cosmopolitan trading hub of the Abbasid Empire. Suddenly, the stories are all about rich merchants, royal court drama, and this vibrant urban nightlife. This is also exactly where the real-life historical Caliph Harun al-Rashid gets transformed into this mythical, late-night adventurer who wanders the city streets in disguise.
And finally, we hit the Cairo or Mamluk layer between the 13th and 15th centuries. The epicenter of storytelling shifted down to Egypt. Now, Cairo during this time was dealing with some incredibly heavy stuff: the brutal aftermath of the Crusades, the devastation of the Black Death, and the literature absolutely reflects that trauma. The themes get so much darker and grittier. Forget the rich merchants, now the main characters are street thieves, lower-class rogues, and con artists just trying to survive. This is also the specific layer that introduced all those heavy supernatural elements we know today. It's here the chaotic forces like the Jinn were suddenly depicted as being bound to physical objects like magical lamps and rings.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The earliest versions of this ever-evolving collection only had a few hundred nights. But let's be honest, 1001 Nights is just too catchy of a title. Over the centuries, depending on the region and the era they were in, later publishers just kept padding the text. They stuffed in local folklore and extra tales until they hit that exact iconic number, 1001.
Now, speaking of those supernatural elements added during the Egyptian layer, we really have to talk about the Jinn. Jinn are ancient supernatural entities that are deeply rooted in both pre-Islamic Arabian folklore and Islamic theology. And I want to really emphasize this point, because that big, blue, wisecracking genie of modern pop culture, that is entirely a Western invention that totally butchered this ancient, complex concept.
And that dramatic shift basically happened because of a simple, lazy mistake. When our guy Antoine Galland was translating those Arabic texts into French, he decided to use the French word Genie. Now, Genie comes from the Latin word genius, which just meant a protective spirit of a place. It was a complete phonetic mistranslation. Because the Arabic Jinn sounded kind of like the French Genie, he just swapped them. And that one little phonetic slip-up permanently warped the creature's identity in global literature forever.
When you actually lay the two side by side, it exposes just how thoroughly Western translators sanitize this highly dangerous free-willed entity. Take their physical composition. The original folklore Jinn is created from smokeless fire, while the Orientalist Genie is just made of sparkly magic or smoke. And morality? That's a massive difference. Original Jinn possess complete free will. They can be incredibly good, purely evil, or perfectly neutral. The translated Genie, though, is strictly bound to whatever its master's moral alignment happens to be. And the wishes, listen to this, folklore Jinn do not grant 3 wishes. No way. They might offer raw power or forced labor, but that strict 3-wish rule is a complete Western addition. Finally, original Jinn are highly dangerous. In folklore, they're known for causing madness and possession. But the Western Genie? Almost always portrayed as harmless, comedic, or enthusiastically helpful.
To really grasp the original tone, you just have to look at the medieval text of the fisherman and the Genie. In the original manuscript, a poor fisherman hauls up a jar and frees the Jinn inside. But the creature is not grateful at all. After being locked in a jar for hundreds of years, this Jinn is bitter, full of rage, and immediately vows to brutally murder the man who just freed him. Like, there are no musical numbers or friendly jokes here. The fisherman only survives by using his wits to trick this terrifying entity back into the jar.
So, all of this brings us to a major identity crisis. As the book was translated into various European languages over the years, it stopped reflecting actual Middle Eastern realities. Instead, it started heavily reflecting Western biases, a phenomenon we call Orientalism. Basically, translators just molded the text like clay to fit whatever agenda or societal norm they felt like pushing at the time. To see this in action, let's look at 3 major Western translators who got their hands on this text and created completely, drastically different versions of the exact same book. We've got Antoine Galland in 1704, Edward Lane in 1838, and Richard Burton in 1885. Starting with Antoine Galland in France. His goal? He wanted this book to be a massive hit with the 18th century French court. To pull that off, he thoroughly sanitized the stories to fit their, delicate sensibilities. He went in and ripped out all the explicit sexual themes and the violent, gory descriptions. He even completely erased the complex Arabic poetry. Ultimately, Galland scrubbed away all the grit to create this delicate, whimsical fairy tale meant to entertain out-of-touch aristocrats. Now contrast that with the English translator Edward Lane over a century later. Lane did something completely bizarre. He somehow mistakenly treated these wild fantasy tales as a literal, accurate anthropological study. He threw out anything he personally found obscene, but then he packed his version with these massive, incredibly dense footnotes detailing Middle Eastern customs. He genuinely viewed these stories, which, keep in mind, are literally filled with magic lamps, fictionalized kings, and shape-shifting fire spirits as an accurate window into how everyday Arab society functioned. It's wild. And then, oh boy, we have Richard Burton in 1885. He did the exact opposite of the other two. Burton shoved all the adult content right back in, but then he intentionally exaggerated the erotica and the violence purely to shock conservative Victorian society. On top of that, he used this bizarre, clunky, archaic English vocabulary in his translation to make the East look intentionally primitive and hypersexualized. Basically, he weaponized the text for his own personal cultural rebellion.
Which leads us with a truly fascinating and honestly a somewhat unsettling question. We've just seen how Aladdin was born in France, how the genie was sanitized from fire to sparkles, and how a single book was warped by translators' biases and cultural agendas. So, if the stories we love most were so easily molded by translators' biases and cultural agendas, what other cultural myths have we blindly accepted as historical facts? Definitely something to chew on next time you crack open a classic book. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the stories behind the stories.